Daf Tzadivav. Kedero shel migdash amai omrach mani yishavru. What are you telling me? You're telling me that if you have an oven where heseko mi bifnim, where the fire always comes on the inside, then if you want to purge the oven of any absorption, you could do so by firing it up from the inside. And if that be the case, then if, let's say, you have the kederos, which are made of earthenware, and it has in the Beis Hamikdash the blia of Isur, because the blia becomes nosar after a period of time. Nadrinolikiv shonos. Why don't we put these pots back into the furnaces, and it'll burn it from the inside? We don't make furnaces in Yerushalayim. It's not appropriate for Yerushalayim because it makes a whole smoke. Omer Abaye, v'chi osin ashpetos bi'azora. Wait a second. We also don't make trash heaps inside the Azara. That's also undermines the honor and the yira, the reverence that we have for the Azara, the holy. And now, what are you going to do? Instead of taking these kederos and putting them into the oven, into the furnaces, you're going to break them into pieces. So what do you do with the shards of this? You're going to throw it into the garbage. And eventually you burn the garbage, and it's going to create a whole smoke in the Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara says that Abaye missed, that Abaye missed an important point. Ishmetise Hadutani, he missed up on a brisa that was recorded by Shmaya Bekalnavo. And what does it say? That Shivrei Klicheres Nivloim B'Makomo, that one of the great 10 miracles that took place in the Beis Hamikdash was that the broken shards of the earthenware were completely absorbed in the ground, in their place. There was no need to burn them like they did with the rest of the garbage. Ela hadi Omer Rav Nachman Omer Rabbi Avo Tanur Shel Migdash Shel Mateches Haya. Why did Rav Nachman that we saw on Daf Tzadi Vavam and Aleph insist on Daf? Tzadi Hayim and Beis. Why did he insist that they did not use earthenware stoves, but rather the stoves in the Beis Hamikdash were made of metal? Why couldn't they make the ovens in the Beis Hamikdash out of earthenware? And what are you going to tell me, that there's an absorption of the Isur inside the oven? Well, the oven is designated for Hasakami Bifnim, which means that the fire comes on the inside, and therefore we could always purge it in the same way. So it's not like a metal pot where the fire comes on the outside. Here the fire comes on the inside. And the Gemara answers, wait a minute. There are situations in which we have a problem because the ikashtei lechem ulechem upon dafiyos betanur k'dishosim betanur v'avalei klisheres uklisheres lo avdinon uklisheres techeres lo avdinon. There's a rule of thumb which the Gemara is going to derive apparently later on, that we don't make a kli shares out of earthenware. Now, a tanur, an oven, is a kli shares. Why? Because what we bake in an oven include also shtei lechem and lechem aponim. And what sanctifies the shtei lechem of Chag HaShavuos and the lechem aponim that's brought weekly from one Shabbos to the other? It's the tanur itself. That means that the tanur is makadesh the lechem. It must be that the tanur has the status of a kli cheres. Has the status of a kli shares. And we have a rule that a kli shares, which is makadesh, that which is inside of it, could never be made of earthenware. And now we turn to Daf Tzadi Vavam and Beis. Ve'afilu Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda says that even a non-metallic kli shares can serve as a kli shares, even though it's not made of metal. But wait a minute, what did it mean? Did Rabbi Yossi mean to say that any any material could be used as a kli. No, 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 no. Lo kamer el d8. He only expanded it from metal to wood. Avol cheres lo, but he never validated a kli cheres for a kli, even though the Gemara in Sukkah Daf Nun records a machlokes between Rebbe, who holds the kli has to be metal. Rabbi Yossi says no, it could be made of another substance. And the Gemara says, because Rabbi Yossi holds that wood is also a very fine substitute for the zav, as we find, for example, the Gemara in Titus says that the menorah that was originally in the Bayis Rishon was made of zav, the Bayis Sheni was made of wood, but not kli cheres. Even Rabbi Yossi would concede that we don't use an earthenware kli as a kli shares in the Beis Hamikdash. Now the Gemara has a story here, which, I feel a sense of kind of anguish in this story, maybe because it's like sort of personal. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yehuda v'Rogel Kamid Rabbi Yami. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yehuda was a Talmud of Rami Bar Chama, and then one day, Shavke, he upped and left his Rebbe Rami Bar Chama. I have enough. He checked out of one class, one yeshiva, and he went to another yeshiva. V'Ozil Rav Sheshes, he went to learn at the feet of Rav Sheshes. You can imagine what Rami Bar Chama felt. Yom Echad Pagabe. One day, Rami Bar Chama meets up with his former Talmud, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yehuda. Amalei, and Rabbi Bar Chama says to his Talmud, and he uses some sort of idiomatic phrase that indicates haughtiness. Al kafta nakton recha osi lo liyad. So this was the idiomatic phrase that says the Duke took me by the hand, and the fragrance of royalty has thereby come upon my hand. In other words, I associated with the Duke. I was one of his political supporters, and as a result, I was elevated to the status of fragrance of royalty. And you think that now that you went to learn by Rav Sheshes, now you're a big shot. You went into the higher class. So right away, Rami Bar Chama sort of accuses Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Yehuda. Mishum de Ozus Leila Kamid Rav Sheshes Havi Loch Ki Rav Sheshes. You think you're on the level of Rav Sheshes? You're such a big shot. My shir, my Torah is below your dignity, but now you're like on the level of Rav Sheshes. It's like when I was in yeshiva. Everybody wanted to go to Rav Soloveitchik's class, so they could say in both, well, I'm a Talmud of Rav Sheshes, of Rav Soloveitchik. Did he understand the Torah? Did he not? There was a little element of gaiva over here. Amalei. So Rabbi Yitzchak defends himself. He says, La mishum hochi, I didn't go to Rav Sheshes in order to say, I'm a Talmud of Rav Sheshes, I'm in Harvard and Yale and Princeton. But rather, Mar ki be'ina milsa, whenever I had a question from you, my Rebbe, meaning Rami Bar Chama, Pasha le misvara, you would give me your knee-jerk response, your intuitive, logical answer. You didn't have any sources to defend yourself. And then ki mishkachas masnisa, and then I would look around to see the words of the Tanoim, because these were Amoraim. And guess what? Parchale, I found a Mishnah or a Brisa that contradicts what you said. But Rav Sheshes keep it in milsumine. But whenever I ask a question to Rav Sheshes, Pashat limi masnisa, he right away quotes a Mishnah or a Brisa, some sort of Tanoic statement. And even if let's say Rav Sheshes had to take into consideration the possibility that maybe they'll find a contradictory brisa or a contradictory mishnah. Masnisa he. Okay, so you have machlokas tanoim, but it doesn't matter. I gave you an answer to your question that is substantiated, and it stands on the shoulders of one Tana. So if you find another Tana that argues, fine. Amalei. So Rami Bar Chama apparently was a little bit sensitive about this whole thing. And he said, you know what, boy mine milsa, why don't you test me out if shitale Loch Kimas Nisan. I sort of challenge you. You're going to ask me a question. I'm going to give you my intuitive answer, and then you go find a contradiction from a Mishnah or a Brisa. Boy mine, so Rabbi Yitzchak took him up on the challenge. Bishel b'miktas kli. We've been talking about the halacha mariko shtifa, where he did a normal cooking, and the basar, the kodshim, spreads, the tam spreads throughout the entire kli. What if he somehow he was able to accomplish his bishul in part of the kli? So does he require mariko shtif? Does he not? Amalei, so Rami Bar Chama, his Rebbe gave him an intuitive answer, based on Svara. He says, "Ain't no time. You don't require Marika Shtifa because Midi the Havi Azah." Right? We have a similar, something similar in Migdash to Marika Shtifa in Bishal Ba Basar Kodshim, and that is if some of the dam of a chatos gets smattered onto a beged, then you have to launder the beged. The Torah requires kibbutz, right? That's the name of that parak, dam chatos, kibbutz. However, the halacha is that you don't have to subject the entire garment from head to toe to the laundering process. You only have to launder that spot where it absorbed the dam. And therefore, by process of analogy, I'm going to apply the same halacha to bishul and the requirement of mariku shtifa, that it only applies to that part of the kli where there was bishul. Comes Rav Yitzchak Bar Yehuda, and he rises up like a lion to the challenge, and he says, Holotanachi. It's very nice that you said that, Rabbi Bar Chama, based on your logic, and you started with and assumed an analogy between Hazah and Kibbutz on the one end and Mariku Shtif on the other. However, what about the following Brisa? Amalei, I don't get it. Rabbi Bar Chama says, what do you mean? You found a Brisa to contradict me? Mistabra Kibegit. Doesn't this analogy make sense logically? And the case here of Miktas Kli should be equal to Miktas Begit. Ma Begit enu tov kibus al makom dam, af Kli enu tov mariku shtif al makom dam, homole midami. Dam lo mefafea, bishum mefafea. In other words, Rabbi Yitzchak is now, fencing against his Rebbe's svara even before he quotes a Mishnah to contradict Rabbi Bar Chama. And that is that there's a fundamental difference between blood. When blood is splattered onto a beged, it remains exactly in that stained place. It doesn't spread throughout the beged. But bishul, if you cook something, so you have the tam of the basar in that part where you cooked, but it spreads throughout the entire vessel. It permeates. V'od, and now I'm going to slug you up from a brisa. Okay, so there are different parts of the brisa. We'll get to the punchline very soon, as far as this duel here between the Talmud and his Rebbe. Chomer b'hazah mimariku shtifa v'chomer b'mariku shtif b'hazah. When we make a comparison between the laws of kibbutz in a case of blood that's smattered onto a beged, and on the other hand, mariku shtifa, in the case where he cooks basar kodshim, you'll find that there's a chumrah in one that doesn't exist in the other, and a chumrah in the other way around that exists in the other one and not in the other one. Let's go through it. Chomer ba'azah, where do we see that the Torah was more machmir? In the case of kibbutz, that's shazah yeshna v'chatos chitzonos chatos pnius. We already had the Mishnah that says that it doesn't matter what chatos it is, if the blood, even of a chatos pnius, gets smattered onto the beged needs kibbutz. Not only that, but yeshna lifnei zrika, even before he applies the dam to the mizbeach, right? There was only, let's say, kabbalah sadam, but no zrika sadam. If the dam splatters onto a beged, you require kibbutz. Masha enkim b'mariku shtifa. In mariku shtifa, it only applies to a chatos hachitzona. The purging and rinsing requirement applies only to vessels in which edible offerings are cooked, as evidenced by the verse that says, this is in Vayikra Vav, that every male amongst the Kohanim may eat it, and therefore it wouldn't apply to a chatas primis, because chatas primis is not eaten at all, nor to any carbon before the throwing of the dam. So this is a special chumrah in the parsha of the smattering, the hatazas hadam, and the required of kibbutz. But on the other hand, chomer beriku shtifa, shamariku shtifa noeges bein b'kodshei kodshim, bein b'kodshim kalim. Right, we said that there was a machlokas in our Mishnah between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon, but let's go now according to Tanakama. The Tanakama extends the application of Mariku Shtifa to include even Kodshim Kalim, like Shlomin. Whereas in the case of Dam that was smattered onto a beged and you require kibbutz, that only exclusively applies to a chatos. It doesn't apply to Kodshim Kalim. But that's not the punchline. Now comes the punchline. Bishel b'miktzas hakli ton mariku shtifa mashen kibazah. The price is about as it's outspoken as you can get, directly contradicting Rabbi Bar Chama the Rebbe, because the Brisa says that in mariku shtifa you required even if he was mavashal in part of the kli and only in part of the kli. But in the case of Azah, you only have to launder that spot which absorbed, the stain which absorbed the dam of the chatos. Amalei Tanya Tanya. So Rabbi Bar Chama said, I tip my hat off to you. I can't argue against this brisa. I didn't know about the brisa, and that's it. So you see, before the next line of the Gemara, I'm just adding a parenthetical insert here, that the Rebbe here was really not on the up and up, meaning there was justification for Rabbi Yitzchak, for Rabbi Yehuda, to leave his Rebbe, Rami Bar Chama, because it's very nice that Rami Bar Chama had these logical, derivations and analogies, but, tachlis, what do the Tanoim say about it? Whereas Rav Sheshes would start by quoting the Tanoim, and then he would explain this. Anyway, the time of my. So why is it that Bishul b'miktas generates a chiv of Mrika Shtif on the entire Kli? And the answer is we're going to derive it from a pasuk. Now, this question of the Gemara, looking for a source, is very problematic. And, there's a whole list of commentaries that wonder about this question. Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Yehuda had just said that that cooking permeates the entire vessel, so the tam spreads throughout the entire vessel, and therefore, even though you vashal b'miktas, the entire kli is subject to that bishul. Hence, it requires mariku shtifa. So why do you press the issue? You have to look for a pasuk. I don't know. So notice the word bikli with a base, because before that it says the word kli without a base. Right? So the pasuk, right, there are two psukim. The first pasuk says kli cheres asher tevusha bo yishover, and then afterwards it says v'im bikli. So the Torah now repeats the word kli, but adding a base as a prefix. And what does bikli come to tell me? Afilu b'miktas kli. Bikli, it's part of the kli, not the entire kli. Vaita, the Mishnah says echad kodshei kodshim. The Mishnah records machlokes between Tanakam and Reb Shimon, whether or not the requirement of the Torah in Vayikra Vav of Mariku Shtifa Umarak Vishuv Maim applies even to Kodshim Kalim. Torah Rabbanon. And now the Gemara is going to look for different sources. The Brisa is going to tell us different sources for these different conclusions regarding Kodshim Kalim. And here's where Truma, as I mentioned at the outset, comes up to the fore. Eli Elachatos. I might think that the requirement of Mriku Shtifa, like Hazah of Dam, only applies to a Chatos. Kol Kodshim Minayin. How do I know that it applies to all Kodesh Kodshim? Talmud Lomer Kodesh Kadoshim. He implying that we expand the requirement of Merikush Shtifa to all Kodesh Kodshim. Yachal Sheni Marbes Hatruma. Well, Truma also has the status of Kodesh. So, by the way, the Gemara here is understanding Kodesh Kodshim not in the technical sense of Kodesh Kodshim, but anything beyond, your strict definition, the highest level of Kodshim, and it applies to all levels of Kodshim. So now the Gemara wants to extend it even to apply to Truma. So I cooked Truma. A Kohen cooked Truma in a vessel, and now, in order to use that vessel now to cook chulin for the sake of a non-Kohen, you would have to do Marika Shtifa, Talmud Lomer Osa. So we have Kodesh Kadoshim as a ribui, and that's going to be Marbe Kodshim Kalim, and we have Osa as a miut. Is that miut is Prat Truma Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda his sheet is reflected in our Mishnah. Reb Shimon Omer, Kodesh Kodshim, Ton Mariku Shtiv, Kodesh Kalmein, Ton Mariku Shtiv, Kodesh Kadoshim. He takes the words Kodesh Kadoshim literally, that it only applies to Kodesh Kodshim, which means it only applies to a Chatos and not to a Shlavim. Kodshim in, Kodesh Kam Lo, Frekting Gemara, my time under Rabbi Yehuda. What is the logic of Rabbi Yehuda? So you can tell me that Yitzrich Osel Amute Truma is Michal the Kodshei Kodshim Kalim to Udim Riku Shtifa. Somehow Rabbi Yehuda understood that the miut here is only a miut for Truma, but that which is higher on the hierarchy of Kodshim would certainly require Riku Shtifa. Right now, it's not clear to us, how did Rabbi Yehuda understand and conclude that the miut here has come to be Memait Truma? Rabbi Shimon Omer Lecha Osa Kamar. Now, you may recall, but this was a few days ago, that we had Rabbi Shimon who spoke about kibus of dam with regard to dam that was nifsal. But what about Hoysala Shasa Kosher? At one point, the dam was royal Lizrika, Lazah. So Reb Shimon had this pasuk Osa, which is the miyat that we have now, and he used it to exclude a case of dam hustle that was once had a Shasa Kosher. So he doesn't have Osa. One second. So Memela, since he used Osa for that. Right, so he's not going to use the word Osa to exclude Truma, whereas Rabbi Yehuda used Osa to exclude Truma, and therefore the implication is that Kodshim Kalim require Mariku Shtifa. Frekti Gemara, Utruma lo boy Shtifa Marika? Are you telling me that both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon agree that in the case of a kli that was used to cook Truma, you don't require Mariku Shtifa? Vatanya, we learned in the Brisa, Kedera Shabishal Babasal, Evashal Babchala, being bishal but osing tam, right? So if you went ahead and you cooked in a milchik pot fleishiks, then you look for a ratio of 1 to 60. Truma lo yavashal b'chulin. So too, if you cook truma in a pot and now you want to cook chulin for a non-kohen, then you're not allowed to use that kli until you do a hechsher for chulin because it was used for truma. V'im bishal ben osing tam. If you went ahead and he cooked chulin in a pot of truma, then we figure out the ratios, if it's 1 to 60. But anyway, we see clearly that with regard to truma, the blia of truma, the tam of truma is in the pot, but that doesn't necessarily prohibit a non-kohen if he subsequently cooks chulin in the pot, because it depends on nosei tam or not. So we see that this whole process of purging the kli, in this case truma, of its absorbed tam applies even to truma. So that basically is Mariku Shtifa. It seems that the Gemara now And I don't know if this came up before. It seems to be equating Mariku Shtifa with just simply purging the vessel of its absorbed tam. I would have said Mariku Shtifa is maybe beyond that, but maybe that's Shtifa. We shouldn't confuse Marika and Shtifa. Marika means actually, boiling up the water and putting it in and then, getting it to be polate the tam. Omar Abai lo nitzcha ela de lida Omar ma. We said that Truma does not require Mariku Shtifa, and yet we see that there's a process by which the Kli absorbed the time of Truma. You have to get rid of it. You have to be machshirit. Is Bishop mixes Kli time Mariku Shtifa's kol a Kli. Truma lo tzarich ela makom bishul. Herein, says Abaye, lies the distinction between Truma and Kodshim. In the case of Kodshim, even if you cooked Kodshim, like Basa Kodesh, in part of the Kli, it needs Mariku Shtifa for the entire Kli, not just the part where you cook. But in the case of Truma, you only need the Mariku Shtifa to get rid of the Tam Truma in a local limitation, only in the place where that took place. Rav Amar, Rav gives a second answer. We'll have a third answer too. Lo tzrich elida Amar Mar b'mayim v'lo b'yayin b'mayim v'lo b'mazu. The Torah says umaraku shutva b'mayim. You can only do marika shtifa in water. You cannot do it in wine. And here we're going to say there's a difference between truma and kodshim. The halacha of marika shtifa and kodshim excludes and invalidates wine. But here in the case of truma, afilu b'yayin, afilu b'mazuk. Mazuk means they used to water down the concentrated wine with 2/3 of water. So basically, it has the status of yayin because it wasn't totally what's the word I want to use? Totally weakened of its tam. Yeah, in Yiddish we'd say it didn't become Wasserdik, it didn't become like water because there was 1/3 of yayin, and that cannot be used as a method of Mriku Shtifa with regard to Kodshim. But in case of Truma, where it's only a matter of getting rid of the tam, then you could use water, you could use wine. Rabba Bar Ula Omar Lo Tzri, he wants to give another answer to where Truma is different than Kodshim. The requirement of shtifa is dafka in cold water. So I don't know if you know this, but even lamaisa would noheg shtifa in a case of hechsher kalim, and this is pure chulin. I think it's somehow like zeichel migdash, like they did in the migdash, where the shtifa was in cold water. It's like, for example, every year I used to go to wherever they sent me, somewhere in the north or south of Israel, to, as part of my miluim of Rabbanut, the Israeli army would send me to a base, and I had to be machshir the kelim for Pesach. And what we did was, after we did the libun or the hagala, we had to have a pot, a pail of cold water, and we put it immediately into cold water. And that's what everybody does when they do the hechsher. But you don't do mishtifa in chamin. Maybe you want to say that the chamin will reabsorb whatever taste is in the water that came out of the pot. But be that as it may, in the case of truma, we don't have these strictures, and you could use even hot water to do the shtifa. Marika has to be bechamin and shtifa bitzonen. I mean, it seems clearly that this marika is something beyond just hechsher kelim. That's a separate mitzvah in kodshim. Anyway, this man the Omer holds that you could do the marika even with chamin. So what makes truma different than any other mariku shtifa? Lamaisa, marika shtifa b'chamin is okay even in kodshim. Michael Meimar, shtifa yiserta. right? So the Torah requires in Kachim an additional shtifa. Now, what does it mean, an additional shtifa? He says here, when the Torah excludes truma from Mariku shtifa, it excludes truma only from rinsing, but not from purging. Okay, this is very, very ambiguous. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Sadi Vav and Beis. And I know the hour is late and it's Erev Shabbos, but let's just at least try to go through the Mishnah. So at least we did the Mishnah, and then we're up to Tzadi Zayin, which is the Shabbos daf. Rabbi Tarfon Omer Bishel B'tchilas Haregel Yivashel Bo Kol Haregel. But now we used a pot to cook basar kodshim at the beginning of Yontif, and now he wants to continue to use the same pot during the entire course of Yontif, and that, according to Rabbi Tarfon, is acceptable and is permitted. He doesn't have to do Marika Shtifa until he finishes the entire Yontif, after he has cooked day after day during the course of Yontif. Racham Omer, no. Adzman achila mariku shtifa. In other words, as long as there's an allotment of time within which you can eat the basar kodesh, then it's okay. You could postpone the mariku shtifa. But once you finish that allotted time, then you have to do mariku shtifa. Marika kimarikas hakos, ushtifa kishtifas hakos. So what's the difference, the Mishnah says, between marika and shtifa? Well, marika is like marikas hakos, like purging the cup, where shtifa means rinsing the cup. Now he explains here the cup refers to a cup of wine over which Birchas Hamazon is recited. There's a Gemara in Brachos. Purging, mentioned by the Torah, is the washing of the inside of the vessel. The rinsing is the washing of the outside of the vessel. Oh, this has to do with kli, with a koshel bracha. Alternatively, purging means scrubbing the vessel to remove food residue. Rinsing means the subsequent running of water over the scrubbed vessel. By saying that these are like a cup, like that of a cup, the Mishnah teaches that the scouring of the vessel in which the offering was cooked need not be more thorough than that which is usually done to a cup. Mariku shtifa bitzonen. Hashpud askala, right? These are a spit, that's used in a barbecue over the fire of a tzli. Magi'ilim b'chamin. You need hagola b'chamin. And the big question here is, why don't you need libun, to put it directly into hot fire? So that's going to be the sunnah. Okay then. So let me wish you a freilich and Shabbos Chanukah, and the Mitzvah Hashem will get together on Yom Rishon. Thank you so much.